So I have felt a spiritual connection to trees and to forest maybe all my life. And living here has enhanced that a whole lot. Over 30 years ago, I visited a place called Muir Woods. Have any of you ever been there? Yeah, a few of you have. It is a preserve of giant redwoods near San Francisco, near the bay. And it was late one day when I found myself there for the first time. I was pretty much alone as I walked among these giants. And I recall stopping to touch several of them. And I could swear that I felt life flowing through the bark. I was amazed and maybe a little bit freaked out. And I maybe attributed it to having just toured maybe half a dozen Napa wineries earlier that afternoon. But subsequent to the visit, the first one, and having gone there about 3 times since then over the years, I visited that hallowed place and the sensation hasn't gone away. The wood that comes from great forests has attracted me all my life, and maybe some of you as well. You feel some of the same when you nods. I've had a violin next to my heart since I was the age of 9 when I first started learning. And I've had a cello next to my chest at least over a dozen years. And I live in a mountain cabin that's made of thick redwood logs that were brought from the Pacific Northwest. About 50 years ago, Crow, was it about 50 years that they made those cabins that you designed up on Saga Mountain Road? About. It feels more like home than perhaps any other place that I've lived. And the forest is why I live here in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And you know, over 70% of our land here in Raven County is national forest. Did you know that? A lot of us. Maybe more than that. And over the past month, our forest has burned. And many of us have focused on the fire as the power of Mother Nature pounding at our door. And rightly so, because a lot of the number of people I knew had to be evacuated from their homes, and they spent time, days on end in some cases, with friends. And lucky they had friends, blessed that they had friends to give them shelter while they wondered if they were even going to have a home to come back to. Now, others of us who regularly hike these mountains, places like the Upper Tallulah River trails and Standing in Indian in North Carolina that burned, the Appalachian Trail and sections of that, we've lamented for the trees themselves as well, and the forest floor that they're rooted in. And we remain anxious to see firsthand what kind of damage may have been done. I'm told that the actual fires burned fairly low, on an average of maybe 4 feet or so, and that the forest trees should survive. However, when we finally see the mess that's created by the new roads and the fire breaks, things like that, those valiant firefighters were making in order to deal with the fire, our senses may be shocked even more. I suspect in some cases they will be, in some cases. But we'll go on, and so will our forest. But I think these events have given some new focus and appreciation for the forest that is our home. And I think that's a good thing. Now, on a gut level, many of us recognize that the forest has a magical place. It's a magical quality. And in the past, even here, I've talked about some of the Celtic beliefs and traditions. The Celts, the ancient Celts in particular, knew that trees and the rivers that flowed through the forests were special places of divine presence, and perhaps a gathering place for spirits in many cases. And they knew not to intrude and never, ever to desecrate these places. Even today, the United Nations has designated sacred groves. These are sacred groves of trees that are recognized for their spiritual and their ecological value, and they're protected. And you can find them in a UN World Heritage List and they're in places as diverse as Japan and Australia and the Philippines and Kenya. All over the world, different groves of trees that the UN is recognizing, the people of the world. Many religious traditions, most of the religious traditions, have long recognized, at least in the past, the connection between our forests and spiritual growth. For example, in Nordic mythology, they believe that the ash tree is a symbol for the world's axis. Interesting. And to go back far again, remember the Buddha. The Buddha sat under a Bodhi tree. How long did he sit there? Does anybody know? Remember that?
Until he was enlightened.
Until he was enlightened. And how long have we honored the tradition of the Christmas tree? A long time. Maybe not as long as the Buddha. The forest is a space that I've found caters to the need for quiet and connection with the earth. And the time spent there, I've noted, strengthens the thread of connection with nature and the principles of life. And it seems sometimes like when I'm sitting in the forest, and maybe you too, I kind of get messages. I was talking to a friend yesterday, Peggy, and she said, I feel messages in some of these places. Sometimes feel that when we're listening to the tall pine trees, for example, the wind moves softly through their needles, and we can feel that, we can hear it, and we wonder if there's a message for us. I find that the forest is really a conducive environment also to learn things like patience and kindness, honesty, responsibility, humility, and diligence. And I believe, for me, that these are core values for a rich spiritual life. There's also a physical nurturing, of course, that comes from living in a forest or near a forest. There's that deep connection and exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. And then there's that miniature world at my feet where the trees are rooted. And there's a community in the decaying wood, the beetles that we aren't aware of that are crawling around, and the fungi, and the tiny soil microbes that are doing their jobs in the soil and replenishing the nutrients of the earth. And those of you who have practiced yoga, have any of you actually practiced yoga in the woods, in the forest? Some of you have. And in that place, it really enhances the mental and the physical stability and health that practice offers. And even there's a tree pose, isn't there, Mary? A tree pose intended to instill rootedness and upper growth. And then there's the tree of life. Didn't wear my tree of life today. I knew there was something I was missing, but my kids had given me a little necklace that's a tree of life, and I really value that. Religious traditions have all kind of had their own version of the tree of life, something that binds heaven and earth and represents that vital connection between the gods, or the God, and humans. But today, tree worship, for the most part, has disappeared from a lot of our modern world, at least. But perhaps not with an organization called Georgia Forest Watch. It's one that I'm involved in. It's a watchdog organization, and it advocates to the U.S. Forest Service for more sustainable forest management. You see, the public owns our national forest, don't we? We own this place. And Forest Watch is one of those organizations that speaks for the trees. They also speak up on issues and government decisions about things like timber cutting and intentional burning and the application of chemicals in the forest, and forest roadways and trails that are being proposed or being changed. I became a member nearly 9 years ago, but I really got involved a little over 4 years ago when a gentleman, his name was Joe Gatens, he asked me to be district lead before he passed away. And so I continue to be involved in that. And it started me on a path to learning more about the science of the forests and the history of forest mismanagement as well, in our region and elsewhere in the country and the world. Things like clear cutting and introduction of invasive species and soil erosion and depletion as a result of man's activities. But, you know, it doesn't take a scientist or even an adult to understand these issues. How many of you are ever familiar with the book by Dr. Seuss called The Lorax? Yeah, some of you? Well, the Lorax kind of got a resurgence of interest, and a number of years ago when some environmental advocacy organizations kind of embraced it. And what it's about, you know, it's not as famous as Green Eggs and Ham, but the Lorax is a story of a place called Thneedville. You heard it right. And it once was a place that flourished with wonderful trees called truffula trees, until a fellow called the Onceler discovered that the tops of these trees could be used and manufactured to a very desirable product called a thneed. I don't have a speech, it's really called a thneed in Thneedville. And this fellow, there's another fellow in the story called the Lorax, who the story is named after. And he was the protector, one of the protectors of the trees. And when they started cutting down these truffula trees, he raised an awful racket. And he told the Onceler, "You can't do this." But he was ignored, and he was made to leave town. Well, you know the rest of the story. All the truffula trees were eventually cut down. And those who became rich from selling the thneeds left for greener pastures. And Thneedville was decimated, excuse me. And there was nothing left but one seed, one truffula seed. And that's how the story ends. And that's given to a little boy. Kind of a sad story. And I hadn't thought about the Lorax for years. I read it to my son when he was a little boy. He's 35 now. He turns 35 for Christmas Eve. Amazing how they grow. But I was auditing a paper mill, pulp and paper company, a few years ago. I was doing an environmental audit, which is what I do, what I've been doing for a long time. And I was interviewing the mill manager. And he was an executive with this company, and he spoke proudly about his company, how they had a commitment to sustainability, and how for every tree that they cut down, they planted at least 3 others. And I nodded and said, that sounds pretty good. Until a friend with Forest Watch told me about a TED Talk. It was called How Trees Talk to Each Other. Have any of you ever seen it? No. Well, okay, at least one. And it was by a Dr. Suzanne Samard, and she talked about her research. She was trained as a forester, and Dr. Samard, for a time, worked for companies in the forest industry. In Canada, this is where she was from and still lives. And at some point she began to question the clear cutting that was going on by this company. It just didn't sit right for her. And so she eventually quit, and she moved to the university scene and began to do forest research. And she knew about some laboratory research that had been done on the exchange of carbon dioxide between seeds. They actually had seeds in a laboratory, and they could exchange carbon dioxide. And they did research about how this is done. It's amazing. There was something going on. So she decided to take this research into the field, into the forest. And she went out and she made some experiments. And to make a long story short, because you really need to check this TED Talk out, she set up these tests in forests of birch and fir and cedar. And she used radioactive tracer chemicals. And using this, she was able to learn some really fascinating things. She learned that a tree in the forest is part of a kind of chemical communication network that is going to let other trees know when one needs carbon dioxide. And that network also facilitates the transfer of carbon dioxide. Amazing, to the trees in need. And she also discovered that this can happen not only between one species, but between different species of trees. That was really amazing. So she conducted her experiments and she replicated them over many years in the forests of Canada. And she learned that there is a world of infinite biological pathways that interconnects trees and allows them to communicate so to speak, and allows the forest to behave like it's a single organism. Amazing. She kind of called it a forest intelligence of some kind with the chemistry that was going on in this exchange. And she explained in her TED Talk that there's this palette of roots and soil that's the foundation of the forest. It's called a mycorrhiza. Remember that word, I'll use it again, a mycorrhiza. It means fungus root, essentially, the mushrooms. And it has these fungal threads that form a mycelium. These tiny little threads are all over, and they're spreading and spreading. And the mycelium infect and they colonize the roots of the trees and the other plants. And where their fungal cells interact with the cells in the roots of the trees, there's a trade of carbon and a trade of nutrients. And we got a dense web that connects all of the individuals in the forest. And it kind of works like the internet, in a sense. It's the way you can mentally think about it. And to take it further, scientists have actually been able to map the DNA of the Douglas fir, as an instance, in a vast forest. They've been able to map the interlinking fungal pathways that feed and connect these trees at that level, at the forest floor level and below. See, the trees are sharing information below ground. Now, in creating these maps, they've discovered that there are hub nodes. We know about kind of hub nodes from internet and that kind of computer technology, but what these hub nodes are old mother trees. And these mother trees are nurturing the younger trees in the forest. Mother trees and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of saplings and younger trees, the mothers sending these nutrients to the seedlings that are in need. There's that communication that I talked about, or she talked about, going on. And the scientists, including Dr. Simard, learned that when a mother tree is injured or dying, it sends messages, these chemical messages, to the next generation of trees that are just beginning to come up. And that includes defensive signals and carbon that help increase their resistance to things like disease and different kinds of stresses, fire included. So what she said, and this disturbs some people, trees talk, so to speak. They're doing some kind of their own kind of communication. And that helps increase the resilience of the whole community. So Dr. Simard pointed out the danger in clear cutting and taking out those large old hub or mother trees. She asked a lot of good questions. She had some good answers too, and that doesn't mean she was listened to, but she asked a lot of good questions, and she really dug deep using the science that she knew and putting it in a form that we could answer. Her conclusions about the sustainability of our forests are these. First of all, forests are complex systems. They have enormous capacity to heal, and that's the good news about the fire and some of the things that have gone on here. And if you do patch cutting as opposed to clear cutting, and if you retain those hub trees, the mother trees, the forest can really recover rapidly. That's really good news. She also advocated for local involvement in forest issues. There's local knowledge and local conditions, because our forest here is nothing like what they have in New Mexico or in the Pacific Northwest or Hawaii or a lot of other places. It's unique. Thirdly, she said we need to save our old growth forests, the ones that are left, because these old growth forests are repositories of genes and mother trees and the mycorrhizal networks that we talked about a minute ago. So these mother trees and these networks can pass down defenses to the next generation. Interesting. And finally, when we replant, there needs to be a diversity of species to allow what she called natural regeneration, which is what happens in the forest. Because forests aren't a bunch of trees competing with each other. They're cooperating. And that is new news to a lot of folks. So I used the word sustainability once here. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. It's the property of biological systems to remain diverse and productive indefinitely, like a long-lived and healthy forest. So why am I sharing all this information in a Wayfarers Unity Chapel? Well, I think we all need to ask some questions about sustainability and what needs to be sustained. Now, from a human point of view, sustainability means meeting basic human needs without destroying or denigrating the environment and the source of resources that places like the forest are, the things that we're going to need to meet our needs. It implies being responsible and proactive in making decisions. And it means having a balance and maybe using some innovation to minimize the impact on places like forests. And creating a balance between things like ecology and economics and political justice and culture. I'm not here now to suggest a call to arms on these issues. That's not what this is about. If you want to take that, that's fine. But I might ask you to consider the idea of sustainability as it applies to our spiritual lives as well, right here and right now. So a little earlier, I suggested that there are core values for a rich and spiritual life, and I mentioned things like patience and kindness and honesty and responsibility, humility and diligence. And I've mentioned that I've spent time in the forest, and that has added to those for me. That's where some of my lessons have come from. Now, I've spent time in this chapel in the woods as well, and I've learned a lot of those same lessons here, being involved. And I'm sustained by this place. This is part of my being spiritually sustained. And I receive nourishment from the human connections that I have here, and learning spiritual lessons from different speakers and just talking to people in my interactions. I get nourishment from things like the meditation and music and loving friendships and an opportunity to give back. And giving back strengthens those connections for me even more, and I dare to say it would strengthen connections for everybody. But I also realize the work that it takes and is going to continue to take to sustain this place. And so I've given some thought to the lessons that Dr. Suzanne Simard had about sustainability and gleaned from her time in the forest and the mycorrhiza. And one of those first lessons was about communication, the essence of what she talked about and researched about. Our own communication network is really important here. We have our newsletter, thank you, Mimi. We have a new website, thank you, Garnet. We have time spent before, during, and even after our services here to talk about and share information and concerns and ideas. But our network is also strengthened by all of these interpersonal relationships that have grown up from this place. And we have a complex web of communication, and that web and that communication needs to be safe and open and constant, and it has to be lively too. We have to keep the energy going. And secondly, we need to be tuned into our own saplings that are under stress in particular. It was a couple of weeks ago, I was telling Laura this morning, well, I was under some stress 2 weeks ago. I had some family things going on. And people came to me and they held me. And it helped me get through that week, for sure. But we all need to be listening deeply to those around us, listening to the rhythms, the breathing. We have to listen with the cells of our bodies, I think, and observe with compassion the lives that are expressing all around us. And we have to be, thirdly, we have to be prepared to offer nourishment when that's needed. Listening and prayer and time and a helping hand and even food and maybe a place to lay someone's head for a temporary time if need be. Every wayfarer here and elsewhere needs to know that somebody cares and that they can safely count on some level of nourishment here. And number 4 is diversity. Dr. Samard talked about diversity and how important it is for a healthy forest. Well, it's important for our strength as well. So diversity of ideas and approaches, diversity of ages and perspectives is going to be the key to having this place wayfarers around 30 years from now, right? Just as diversity allows a forest to naturally regenerate. And finally, we have to support the mother tree. There's the mother tree, this place. And so we need ideas and time and talents and sweat and calluses, and of course the financial support too, from everyone who values this place and wants the doors to stay open and wants this community to be sustained as their spiritual home.